Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, should ex-offenders be denied the right to vote? Well, they often are in Maryland, and argues law professor Michael Pinard, that's bad for them and bad for the rest of us. If God made all creation, then why aren't evangelicals up in arms over man-made climate change? Well, a growing number are, like Dr. Matthew Sleeth. Are chemicals in the Potomac River causing the very same fish to develop male and female sexual characteristics? We chat with riverkeeper Ed Merrifield. Also, Brazilian music with Du Maracatu, and poetry by Judith Harris, Native Son, and Thomas Sayers Ellis.
Naturally, this will scare the civil rights out of some, and for a mad moment, empower a great many wrong-cultured others.
Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. When people commit serious crimes, should that permanently disqualify them from exercising the rights of citizenship, like voting? It might strike you as odd, but the rights of ex-offenders are decided by each of the 50 states, even if it was a federal law that they violated, and even if it's a federal election they want to vote in. So an ex-offender who resides in D.C. or Pennsylvania or even Georgia can vote for president or Congress, but one who lives in Maryland, Virginia, or Delaware perhaps cannot. If this all seems rather arbitrary, you likely won't get a big argument out of Michael Pinard. Michael is an assistant professor of law at the University of Maryland School of Law, where he teaches criminal process and procedure and the Reentry of Ex-Offenders Clinic. Before coming to Maryland, Michael taught at law schools such as Washington University, St. John's, and Yale, and served as a public defender in New York City. Welcome, Michael, to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
In the state of Maryland, some ex-offenders are denied the right to vote.
Right.
Who are they? Why are they denied that right?
Well, Maryland has a pretty quirky law, and so it's a little complicated, but let me say it the simplest way I can. So in Maryland, if you are convicted of an infamous crime, and there's over 100 infamous crimes in Maryland.
Give us some examples of what's infamous.
It could be writing a fraudulent check, for instance, or uttering a false document. And the list goes on and on and on. So those are just some examples. But essentially, if it's your first conviction in Maryland, you have to wait until your sentence is complete to be able to vote. So for instance, if you're in prison and then you're released, and let's assume you're on parole, you have to wait till you finish parole to be able to vote. If it's your second conviction, for, again, nonviolent, infamous crime, felony, whatever you want to call it, whatever you choose to call it, but you then have to wait 3 years after the completion of your sentence. So the same example, you're in prison, you come out, you're on parole. Once your parole ends, you have to wait 3 years to vote. If you're convicted of 2 violent felony offenses in Maryland, then your right to vote is forever denied. You cannot vote for the rest of your life.
Now, can you get it back if the governor commutes your sentence, or not commutes your sentence, but offers some kind of? Is there a way you can get your right to vote back?
If you were pardoned essentially by the governor, then you could do that.
It's pardon.
But if you're convicted of 2 violent felony offenses, it would take you a long time to pardon an offense.
Yeah.
You'd have to wait, I believe it's 20 years before you can even see
I mean, what's so wrong with that? The reality is somebody commits a serious offense repeatedly. Right. Shouldn't they be stripped of the fundamental rights of citizenship?
Well, this again assumes that the person is now out of prison, right? So, so the person is now back in the community, and therefore we as a society deem that that person is suitable to live in the community, whether that person has served prison time or not. And let's again focus on the fact that you don't have to serve a day in prison for you to be denied this right to vote, okay? But essentially, once you are part of that community, you should be able to exercise your voting rights just like anybody else in that community. And denying the right to vote actually further stigmatizes these individuals, and they're already stigmatized a great deal in their lives. And voting is one of the most fundamental ways in which we can voice our opinion in the processes and the times of our day.
Does this affect a lot of people?
It affects right now, today, it affects 110,000 individuals in Maryland.
Who are deprived the right to vote.
Who are deprived of the right to vote.
Is this consistent in other states? Other states do it differently. What about the area, Virginia, D.C.,
Right.
Pennsylvania?
Well, the states do it differently, and there's wide variation amongst the states. So in Virginia, anyone convicted of a felony, you cannot vote. In Virginia,
One felony.
Right. Virginia is one of 11 states, and Maryland is one of 11 states as well. Maryland is among this list that, in some circumstances, deny the right to vote forever. But Virginia, essentially, one felony, you're not going to be able to vote forever. Delaware, if you have a felony offense, I believe you wait 5 years after the completion of your sentence. Pennsylvania, you're denied the right to vote if you're in prison. Felony conviction, you're in prison. Once you step outside those prison gates, your right to vote is restored, and same as in Washington, D.C.
You were saying before that when people, they've done their time, are now back in the community.
Right.
Is there some evidence that when people vote that they are better citizens, less likely to commit crimes
Well,
again?
there was a study done by a couple of sociologists, and they argue or they found in their study that those who have the right to vote and exercise their right to vote are actually 50% less likely to recommit crimes. So that's the one study that's out there that shows a correlation between having the right to vote and decreased criminal activity.
But that could be a chicken and egg kind of thing, right? It could be somebody who has come back in the community, has become an upstanding citizen in other aspects of their lives and nonviolent and non-offending, and part of that whole package is that they become a participant in the electoral process.
Right, and that's possible, but it's also very possible that the person has started out that process by exercising their voice in the process, which again is a very, very important way for us to exercise our voice in the affairs of society.
Now this affects society more broadly, not just the individual. I'm thinking back now to the year 2000 and the elections in Florida.
Right.
Florida has a law that disqualifies one-time felons as well, right?
That's correct.
And how did that affect the outcome in the Florida vote?
Well, it's really
presidential vote.
Right. Well, first of all, there were also a bunch of individuals in Florida who were purged from the polls, in fact, because of offenses, and later found out that some of those individuals really were wrongfully purged. But basically, these same sociologists found in Florida that the number of individuals who were disenfranchised, if you sort of generalize what their political affiliation was, then the outcome would have been different in 2000.
And of course, there were all sorts of other factors going on in Florida at that time,
Right,
but that's
absolutely.
one, the hanging chads,
Right, absolutely.
the Jews for
Right.
Buchanan, the Nader factor, but
Too
this
much
was
for-
one
right.
that in and of
Absolutely.
itself would have
Right.
turned the election.
Right.
Tell me about other ways that ex-offenders attempting to re-enter society, what opportunities or rights are denied them that
Right.
the rest of us have?
Well, there are, and let's take Maryland, for instance, because the laws, again, are very, very different. It's a mixture of federal law and state law and local law. But an individual leaving prison in Maryland will have a very hard time finding housing, because public housing most likely will be denied to that individual. And it depends on the county in Maryland, but I'll take Baltimore City as an example. So in Baltimore City, if you're convicted of a misdemeanor offense, and again, let's be clear. I don't want to sort of just put out there that these are only individuals who are incarcerated who are suffering from these deprivations. But misdemeanor conviction,
Misdemeanor imprisonment for less than 1 year.
Right, right, exactly. Misdemeanor conviction will render an individual ineligible for public housing for 3 years after that conviction. If it's a felony, it's 5 years. So we often deal with individuals in my clinic who are leaving prison who cannot get public housing, right? So private housing, private landlords can often use a criminal conviction to deny housing. So housing is a big issue.
Is that a right of a landlord to deny housing on the basis of a criminal record?
Certainly, they can do that.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. Employment is a huge obstacle. Maryland, over 500 jobs, you need a license to perform that job. So you apply for a license or certificate for the job, and these agencies have the discretion to consider your conviction in either granting you or denying you that license. So individuals then have to solve a huge uphill battle just to get a license based on their conviction. So
if you had a license going in, would you be stripped of it?
Yes, right. So you're going to have to apply to get it back again. It'll be suspended, or it'll be revoked. So you already have housing issues, you have employment issues, you have family reunification issues. So the list really goes on and on and on. So it's an uphill battle for anybody leaving a prison, really anywhere, but also here in Maryland.
Governor Ehrlich launched an effort called Restart, I think
Right.
it was called, in order to help reintegrate ex-offenders in the community. How's
Right.
that working?
Well, that's a great program in theory, and I think it's only been launched in about 2 facilities in our state. So it hasn't been funded as it should be funded, and a lot of the facilities.
What would it do if it were funded?
Well, it's wraparound services, and it includes drug treatment and various other services that help individuals while they're in prison and prepares them for reentry. And it's a great program on paper, but it's only been funded, I believe, in 2 facilities. So the vast majority of facilities, Restart has not happened for them yet. And it really it upsets a lot of folks at these facilities, because I think everyone recognizes that if implemented, it could do a lot of good things, but it just has not received the funding it should have received by now.
What should we be doing?
Who's we?
We as a society, in order to ensure that when we bring former offenders back into our midst,
Right.
that we're creating an environment that's going to provide for our safety,
Right.
which I would assume involves making sure that their lives are sufficiently on track that they're not going to turn against us.
Right. Well, we should really recognize the fact that these are individuals who have already served their time, who have already, quote unquote, paid their debt to society. And I believe that's something we grew up sort of knowing, that once you pay your debt to society, you're supposed to be restored. So we as a society first should recognize that and really live by that. But also concretely, we should just recognize that the individuals who leave our facilities, or the individuals with criminal convictions, are burdened by all these deprivations that we don't know about as a society. That's a really big issue, as well as I don't know that even today in 2006 that most of us really recognize the extent to which a criminal conviction can really impede a person upon reentry. So we should just gain that knowledge as
Now,
well.
practically speaking, if I know in my neighborhood
Right.
that somebody's moving in who's come out of prison
Right.
recently and could be for some significant offense,
Right.
would I be rational in treating them as if that hadn't happened?
No, of course, it'd be natural if you knew about that to treat that as if it had happened. But it'd also be natural for you to want to make sure, I would believe, I believe you would think it's natural to make sure that person is in the best position so that he or she does not do that again, right? So you'd want to, I would think, provide services to that individual to make that person a whole member of society again. And I think you probably would feel a little less safe if you recognize that that person is really not made whole by his or her release into your community. So another thing we could do is speak to our legislators, our representatives about these issues as well. And I think one of the key issues is that really the folks who are coming out of prison, just like the folks going into the criminal justice system, really come from very few communities in the state of Maryland, right? So folks returning to Baltimore, 60% actually from leaving Maryland prisons return to Baltimore. 30% of those return to 6 out of 55 neighborhoods. So if you don't live in one of those 6 neighborhoods, you might not feel invested in it. So one of the things we can really do is recognize that even though these individuals might not live on our block, they're really part of our community as well.
And we're talking about 11,000, 12,000 people coming out of Maryland prisons every year back into the community.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for taking your time to talk with us today, Michael Pinard,
problem.
University of Maryland Law School. And we'll be watching to see if improvements are made in our treatment of ex-offenders and see if, as a society, when we strip serious offenders of their rights to fully participate in the community, if in taking new action to redress those questions, those problems, that we bring them back into full functioning members of our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One of these badass, glorious days, the signs and negative sounds that worked against us will all begin their 10 years of service, holy and complex repentance. It has already begun with nigger and bitch. And for this we have young folks to thank, their disrespect and fearlessness. Naturally, this will scare the civil rights out of some, and for a mad moment empower a great many wrong-cultured others. To this, the return would either code switch or hood ornament, drama drumming both, occult Nat's matrimony of the vernacular remix. Ain't studding you, no mo, no more, no mo, stop studding us. All y'all who tell y'all hearts art. Your Bama hour is again up struggling as we credits and debits alike hang and unhang the old slanders ourselves. Not as segregationists, although that wouldn't be that bad given, and not as air Februarians given, but as identity repair people, faders of trick moves, tropodopes, and okey-dokes, laying our dice down like we love us.
Welcome to the Willing Spirit at the Coffee House. For many years, American evangelicals have been closely identified with a few hot-button political issues, primarily their opposition to abortion and to gay marriage. But this has been changing in recent years, and at the beginning of this year, a group of 86 prominent evangelical leaders signed on to a major initiative to fight global warming. Now, there's been backlash within some parts of the evangelical community, but there's also significant support for making personal and political changes to save our environment. My guest today is on the leading edge of that movement, that creation care movement. His concern for the planet has led him and his family to significantly alter their lifestyle. He's quit his job as an emergency room physician, downsized his house and his lifestyle, and in the process, changed his sense of what it means to be a faithful Christian in our day. Dr. Matthew Sleeth has written about his journey and his desire to build a bridge between mainstream Christians and the environment and the environmental movement in his new book, Serve God, Save the Planet, A Christian Call to Action. Thanks, Dr. Sleeth, for joining us on the Coffee House.
Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here.
Could you just start by telling us a little bit about this personal journey that's led you to make such significant changes in your life over the last few years?
Well, I found that many diseases had changed significantly since I started medicine. The incidence of cancers and asthma and other diseases had gone up. And also I've just noticed changes in the world that we live in as far as decrease in birds and wildlife and that sort of thing. And particularly being led by changes in things I was seeing in the emergency room. And in the book I talk about people, not statistics, but seeing 3 women that I admitted in a week's time, all in their 30s, all to die from breast cancer, and talk about a young girl that died from asthma. It really led me to go to my faith, and my wife and I discussed what should we do about this. And when I read the Bible specifically, looking for the answers to what should I do, the Bible said I need to change myself first. And so our family went through a process of changing our life and going from a doctor-size house to one the size of our old garage, and cutting our electric use to 1/10 of the national average and our fossil fuel use to 1/3. And that's what I write and talk about now.
And when you say that you went to the Bible and found support for doing that, can you say a little bit more about that? I mean, there's not a lot of Bible passages on, fuel use or whatever. What was it exactly about your faith that led you to make some of these changes?
Well, one thing that the Bible has from beginning to end is an emphasis on the created world as a gift to us that we're here to manage as stewards. The Bible starts with the tree of life and ends in the last chapters with 2 trees of life in heaven, and the water's unpolluted, we're told, and it mentions trees 500 times, just in generic, not the specific, I love the tall trees of Lebanon. Don't cut down a tree if you're sieging your enemy even. And there's a language of life, and there's also a language of responsibility that we're called to take this as a gift and as not as an entitlement.
Now, one of the words that's used a lot, or at least that's prominently used often by those who argue against some of the changes that you're suggesting we need to make in terms of taking care of the environment, one of the words that so often comes back up again in that argument is the word dominion. How do you understand that word?
Well, dominion comes from a Hebrew word that means higher on a root. And I believe that as humans we are, in a sense, higher than other animals. But if you take that root analogy, no matter how high you are in a tree, if you cut the roots out from underneath you, you're dead. And one way I like to think of it is that my parents gave me a bike when I was a kid. I had dominion over it. My parents didn't have the money to give me another bike if I didn't exercise good dominion. And dominion, I think, has been confused with license, and they're not the same. Dominion implies a stewardship and a responsibility to everyone on the planet now and everyone that will come.
Well, what do you make of, like, for example, the commandment to be fruitful and multiply?
Well, I think of all the commandments of love your neighbor as yourself and visit people in prison or take care of the hungry and the sick and clothe the naked and be fruitful and multiply. Probably be fruitful and multiply is the first one we can check off as having been able to fulfill.
So we've completed that commandment.
That commandment is also given by God to all the animals and plants. So there's a balance there.
Now, there's a lot of people in the United States who read the Bible who don't necessarily come to the conclusions that you come to. In fact, sort of the lifestyle that you've described is a minority lifestyle within our country. What is it that you think, what are the barriers? What barriers have you found within the Christian community, within the evangelical community, to making steps towards becoming better stewards of our environment?
Well, I think that most of us grew up in church not having sermons about this. And one thing that I do when I go to a church is bring along a 120-year-old Nelson Study Bible and open it up to the 45 pages in the back on care of plants and animals. And we simply live in an era where we have confused consumerism with love and of the Lord or a practice of faith. In Christianity, we believe that Christ is the model of the perfect life. And to have someone who only owned one coat instead of if you had two, give the extra one away, and didn't have a home, and only rode a horse once and it was borrowed, and my lifestyle where I found myself, there was such a huge gap that we're supposed to work towards being more like Christ. And another thing is that Christ gives a new commandment that we love one another. And at least when I looked at our lifestyle, we weren't acting that out to the extent that I felt good about.
Yeah, but what are the barriers to living that kind of life? If it's so obviously laid out there in the Bible, what's keeping us, especially those of us who would identify as people of faith, what's keeping us from making those changes?
I think it's our selfishness and confusing our wants with our needs. One thing I like to point out is that it wouldn't be considered strange to say grace before a meal in a Bible-believing home, and that's because we view food, that 500-calorie meal, as a gift and not an entitlement, and that we realize there are people around the world that don't have it. And saying thank you to the Lord puts us in a right relationship with God, with a thankful heart. But if I fill up my car and I never said the same prayer of thank you for the 1,000,000 calories of energy that our lifestyle is dependent on, is it because I felt entitled? Or is it just because I simply didn't think about it? Or I didn't realize other people didn't have access to it? So I think part of this will change when more and more people of faith actually look at the issue a little more and read their Bibles and see what it has to say, and they're hearing more sermons and hearing more of the leaders, like you mentioned, that have signed a pledge to do better.
Now, within the American evangelical community, there's been sort of even greater resistance to making some of these changes or prioritizing environmentalism as a church issue, as a Christian issue, even over and above some other parts of communities in this country. I know that at least within some parts of American conservative Christianity, there's this Left Behind movement that has this sense that this world isn't going to be around for that long. Do you think there's any barriers within sort of the theology or within the religious understanding, I mean, beyond just selfishness and the?
Well, I think there have been barriers, and I think one of the barriers is that you mentioned in your introduction that care of creation has been bundled with other issues that Christians, conservative Christians, might find unacceptable. But I think what you'll see is an unbundling of these. The Bible says that the Lord makes the rain to fall on the wicked and the just. Unfortunately, the acid rain does the same thing, and the climate change and that sort of thing. So I think you'll see more and more cooperation in the future where these issues are unbundled, and what we're getting to is we need to have clean air, clean water, and our children need to have a place to live that's healthy for them. And I just think that you'll see more, and I'm seeing that. One of the things I have to tell you that I'm so happy about is to see how fast evangelic communities can change. If you look up conserve in the dictionary, it's a beautiful definition. It means to care for something specifically with regard towards the future. So yes, I'd like to put the conserve back in conservative, but I see churches change very, very rapidly, and I'm quite encouraged by that.
Say a little bit about some of the changes that you've seen within evangelical churches.
Well, I'm here in Washington, D.C. visiting this weekend, and have met with 2 churches during the whole weekend, which are trying to decide how they can build green now, and how they can, one of these is an evangelic church, and how they can be proper stewards and be a light to the world of conserving these resources that are getting more and more expensive. There's also a growing understanding that people in the world, in what's called the third world sometimes, are now dependent on us to supply the resources because they've lost all their topsoil and trees and that sort of thing. So there's even a missions aspect to this. Which
Do you see that beyond some of the political and the personal conservation efforts that you're talking about, any kind of political action being taken by churches at all, or people in that community?
There's 300,000 houses of faith in the United States, and I think as this becomes more and more of something that they're taking leadership in it, you'll see them be able to help lead the way in this politically.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Matthew Sleeth, for joining us. Your story is inspiring personally, but also very challenging. And the actions that you suggest that we take, both personally and corporately, are significant. But so is the threat to our environment posed by global warming. I'm Heather Kirk-Davidoff, and this has been The Willing Spirit.
I walked to the beach and sat on the shores of the land, spoke word to a dry fish in the form of a man painting pictures with seashells in the moisture of the sand. He entertained me, spit wisdom through 5 arts, his scales are sharp like Mayan war darts. He's crazy and like a truth as humming old school tunes, transforming tidal waves into helium balloons. Someone call a doctor quick. His language is sick. Intelligent, equipped with chick repellent, kryptonite is liquid, but that's irrelevant. Holding his breath for the hell of it. The ocean floor is too low for him, he refused it as a settlement. He told me to do the same. He said, native son, watch the sun, because it already done stole your name. Before you know it, it'll be rising in the east, with the ability to awaken those who are asleep. He said, why do you think I left the aquatic? Sea monsters were hating and the mermaids were jocking, because I'm more than a legend. And I took their women. Wait, let me begin from the beginning. I walked to the beach and sat on the shores of the land, spoken word to a dry fish in the form of a man with the map of life engraved in the palm of his right hand. We traded wisdom for hours, and on every hour the ground tilted, causing a shift in the sand. Unnoticed, the clouds took notes of every phrase we quoted. We noticed, then switched the style to wind talk, because it's hard to decode it. He told me a secret, I wrote it. The pages became corroded. My book was overloaded. The thoughts were so heavy, I was straining to hold it. We discussed his plans to take over the planet. He said, David, I drink 2 cups of cement a day to change my heart to granite. He already hired a blacksmith to weld him an iron fist, thick at the knuckles, thin at the wrist, claiming the only abyss through it exists is in a deep darkness of mist in his mind. I thought about it for a moment, then burst into rhyme like fireworks to go off, blazing the skyline, the decline or rewind. My mind is set like clock. This must be a sign like one-way yield and stop. We lost track of time. New Year's already, we paused again to watch the ball drop. Then he moved under the palm tree because the sun was getting hot. Knowing me, I never shine on those who stand in the shade. Just like how when it rains, it reminds me to never get a fade. And if you didn't get it, you missed it, so don't worry, because neither will you ever find the truth in the library, boy. I get my inspiration from McKay and MV Cherry. You better ask somebody. P for P got this thing locked like my hair stay naughty, so I guess you can call this a respect piece to those who lift me. Or maybe it's just to prove how smooth I can be with words, make prose out of nouns and perfect the regular verbs to trigger the transmitters on the ends of your nerves. Never been a waiter, but MCs will get served the dessert they deserve. Pardon the poetic curve, didn't mean to get off topic and disrupt your logic. You need to focus on the object and readjust your optic, especially when the truth is microscopic. The style cannot be adopted. Believe me, many have tried it, fallen and forgotten, left dead stinking and rotten by this overlooked bombshell hailing from Coppin. Run it back. I walked to the beach, planting my feet deep in the sand, finally recognizing the man that I am, and on the way met a dry fish who taught me to slam.
Welcome to 21st Century Life at the Coffee House. We are all familiar with conventional environmental threats, deforestation, sprawl, global warming. These are huge concerns, but at least the causes and solutions are readily understood and therefore potentially fixable. But in recent years, a new and rising concern has emerged in the Potomac River and its tributaries in other parts of America. The problem has a name seemingly out of science fiction: endocrine disruptors. Turns out researchers have now found male fish throughout the Potomac River system, including in D.C., that are actually carrying eggs. This female characteristic in male fish is not only weird and profound and relatively new to science, it's something researchers don't fundamentally understand. But it appears that many of the 87,000 different chemicals used by human beings for everything from pesticides to birth control are actually flowing into our waters and disrupting the hormones of fish. Could the same impact affect the 3.6 million D.C. region people who get most of their drinking water from the Potomac River? Maybe, say scientists. Worse, there may be no way to solve this problem short of stopping the flow of all human-use chemicals into our waters, a task of mind-boggling dimensions. Here to discuss this troubling new threat is Ed Merrifield, Director of Potomac Riverkeeper, headquartered here in the D.C. area. Ed, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
First of all, I just want to, this is such a strange issue, these so-called intersex fish, male fish that actually have immature eggs in their testes. How widespread is it? Where are we finding these fish? Is it growing, or are we just getting better at finding them through research?
It was first found in 2003 in the upper Potomac when West Virginia asked the federal government to come in and help them try to find the cause of some fish kills going on. They never found the cause, but they found that the male fish had eggs in their testes, about 80% of them. And since then, that was 2003, it's been found in all other parts of the Potomac, down through and the other side of D.C. now.
Does this seem to be a problem that's growing and spreading, or is it perhaps that we're just we're doing more research to find it? Is this sort of like the snakehead that, you know, they're multiplying and all that, or has this been here all along and we're just now finding it?
It's difficult to say, but NOAA in 2002, they did a report that said this isn't just ubiquitous, it's found around areas where there is increased pollution. So whether we've just started to look for it and it's been there or not, it isn't everywhere. It's going to be around areas where there's increased pollution.
And it is everywhere in the Potomac tributary system, even in the District of Columbia. They're finding these strange male fish with female eggs.
Yes.
And so what's causing it?
Well, what's causing it are groups of chemicals called endocrine disruptors. Basically, they're simply anything that can produce these reproductive abnormalities. You mentioned one area, pesticides and sometimes antibiotics that are fed to to chickens in the chicken industry, and other hormones that are fed to animals. But also birth control pills, when these chemicals are put in increase, they disrupt they cause endocrine problems. So it's just about everything. Pharmaceuticals, personal care products. One of the antibiotic soaps that the antibiotic soaps that we all use, that many people use, they have a chemical in them called triclosans, very common chemical that also is in that category of endocrine disruptors.
And there are a number of researchers who are convinced that it's probably not one single chemical, but it could be a cocktail, a combination of different chemicals that come together to cause these problems. And if so, you're talking about an infinite number of possible combinations of chemicals. How in the world do you get a grip on that in terms of a solution?
Well, the solution has to be not putting the chemicals into the water. Clean Water Act in 1972 had as its goal, written right into the act, that we will have zero pollution going into our waters, man-made pollution, by 1985. And although that timeline has been stretched out by the courts, the fact is there really is no perfect answer to this. The best we can do is to go back to that goal and get the chemicals out of the water. We'll never know which ones it'll be. Next year, there could be different chemicals causing the problem we'll have to worry about.
Well, let's come back to the possibility of solutions down the road. But first of all, where else is this happening? These sort of intersex fish or other species, fish with male fish with female characteristics and vice versa. Is this happening anywhere else in America?
It's happening in many different areas in America. For instance, you mentioned female fish with male characteristics. There's an area on the Ohio River where a large meat packing industry is there, and the hormones that had gone through the steers and the cows made it into the water and changed the sex of the fish, worked in changing the sex of the fish. We know about it from New York and PCBs and some other areas, some problems we have here, Colorado, Las Vegas, West Coast.
So it's happening in other areas,
yes.
Including here. Here's the big question everybody wants to know. I mean, it's one thing to think about global warming in the future and deforestation out in the West and all that, but this is our water right here that we're drinking. The fish are showing very strange characteristics that seem highly abnormal and, frankly, scary. I drink that water. My 9-year-old son drinks the water from the Potomac. Could this be affecting us?
Well, that's the issue. If they can't yet tell us, they know it's chemicals in the water that are producing these reproductive abnormalities. I mean, that's a fact. Which ones it is, they can't tell us yet. And if they can't tell us which chemicals it is, and all of that water is flowing by and some of it into our drinking water intakes, there really is no way they can tell us that it's not getting into our drinking water. I mean, it's more a matter of logic than science here. So we don't know. We don't know. Although I should mention that our drinking water facilities here do a great job of filtering out and taking care of the water according to current EPA standards. But this is something new.
But they're not screening for some of these
Absolutely
things.
Absolutely not. None of this is being screened for. That's one of the issues here.
And so let's get back to this. There are estimated like 87,000 known human-use chemicals. They're in our environment. They're in the air. They're on our crops. They flow into the rivers, and they get in there and they begin to sometimes combine. And can you develop a filter that could take into, in these water treatment plants, that could take into account all the possible combinations of these 87,000 different chemicals? I mean, is it possible to filter these out?
Oh, to filter them out?
Yeah.
As opposed to the combinations, just filter them out. Well, we know there are a lot of best management practices that could be used that could make us a lot safer. I mean, chemicals that get into the air and end up getting deposited in the water, that might be a little different. But again, there are ways of filtering those out. I mean, there are ways of not putting sewage water back into the, directly back into the, into our water until it's even been filtered more than it has been to this point.
So because there are so many chemicals and they can have these different combinations in the water that could disrupt the hormones, presumably not just of fish, but other aquatic animals and potentially us,
Right.
You're saying the only real solution is to stop the flow of all these chemicals into our waters. How do we do that?
That's the long strategic plan we're
You
going
mentioned
we're going to have to work towards.
the Clean Water Act of it's set as a goal, 1985, no more pollution. We're obviously not there. How do we get there?
Well, there's two types of pollution. There's legal and illegal pollution. First, we make sure we get rid of all the illegal pollution right now. Strict enforcement is what it needs. And the legal pollution, of course, that's going to take changing policies, and that has to be done too before this can happen.
But what about the birth control pills that are thrown into the sink? What about we're talking also caffeine and antidepressants and pesticides. I mean,
public awareness of doing the right thing has to be there too, just like it does in so many other issues. For instance, we shouldn't be throwing our chemicals, our pharmaceuticals, into the toilet, which is one of the things we once thought was the best way to do it.
Right.
There should be other ways of taking care of those. I mean, there just are a lot of issues that need to be taken care of here to make sure we keep the chemicals out of the water.
Now, it certainly gets our attention when we see these extreme abnormalities in fish right here, just a few miles from this studio, in the Potomac River, the nation's river flowing through the capital. And so I think there are more and more people who are saying, well, we need to do something. And the Europeans are doing something. I mean, the problem of endocrine disruptors, chemicals that disrupt the hormones of living things, has been found in Great Britain and other places. And Europe's moving forward with a system to catalog and test potentially toxic new chemicals?
Europe has always been more cautious with chemicals they produced and allowed into the public than America has. And it's time we at least caught up with that. That's sort of that midterm. The long-term strategic plan is to make sure we remove all of these. But the midterm part would be to make sure we know what's happening, what's going into our air and our water by having better tested chemicals.
So you could have a registry. Now, these 87,000 chemicals that we know are out there and being used in the United States, how many are tested? How many do we, what percentage of those chemicals do we have a pretty good grip on? This is toxic, this is not toxic.
Well, just a couple of weeks ago, I mean, even taking it to the smaller, just a couple of weeks ago, the House Committee on Government Reform had a hearing on this issue. And an example, 10 years ago, the EPA, 1996, was asked and funds were appropriated to study endocrine disruptors. 10 years later, at this House and Government Reform, they weren't able to name one endocrine disruptor and what it was doing. So there's just a lot of catching up to do. And to answer your question, we can't take care of the smaller issues. It's really very difficult.
So the vast majority of those 87,000 chemicals that are out there, we don't quite know the carcinogenic, the cancer-causing problems that they may bring, or other problems.
We have not been as cautious as we should have been over the years. There's no doubt about it.
So here's another question. We know that there are bass that are swimming under the 14th Street Bridge right now in Washington, D.C. that have eggs, female characteristics, eggs in immature eggs in their testes. Very, very strange. Is this genetic? Is this DNA? Are they going to pass it on? I mean, is this here to stay? Or is this something that if we clean the waters, their offspring will be fine?
Can't answer that. Right now, it's being said that even though there are a lot of different hypotheses how this works, what's being said is that it's due to these endocrine disruptors in the water right now. Whether the changes that occur will be passed on, I can't answer that. I don't think anybody can answer that yet.
And we need more study. I mean, one of the things about this issue, again, there are so many environmental concerns out there, but most of them we know the problem, and therefore we know they can be fixed. This is one where we're still learning, and
That's right.
and it's a potentially very unsettling issue. And I want to thank you for being on the show, and hope to have you back on again, where perhaps we can know more about the issue and talk more about solutions. Well, a big thanks to Ed Merrifield for discussing the growing problem of endocrine disruptors in the Potomac River and its tributaries. The unsustainability of many aspects of our daily lives is clearly being expressed by, of all things, male fish carrying female eggs. Perhaps we finally met the issue that prompts us to profoundly rethink and rearrange our interactions with the earth. I'm Mike Tidwell, and this has been 21st Century Life.
How many coats of darkness can there be as a child falls asleep, like a story within a story, or a doll within a larger doll, like the wooden dolls my mother wrapped up in 2 small boxes and carried home from Haifa? Green dresses, bowed kerchiefs, and painted faces, bellies halved and shellacked in bakers' aprons, girths wide as the earth itself, belted with a tiny crack at the middle. My mother never told me how babies were born, only that the body unscrewed itself like a jar, and that the shell peeled open, and inside the seed that would begin the child like a sprout growing, a girl within a finished girl, as a maze uncoiled upon the map, or a bobbin of thread unwinding, or a branch unraveled from the licorice twist of wind, or the sky lifting up yet another hollowed mask. Now I have my own daughter, a scroll of flaxen hair laid in the spread palms of afternoon, and I wonder what she dreams as she spirals down into the dark orchard I meant to plant inside her, and the darker orchard underneath. And there a gardener gathers under the base of the tree more red and gold in airy baskets, until one day my daughter will eat the flaky seed that will split her in two and break the sky like a cranny of thunder. My daughter was born in summer among the lemons and roses. What my mother told me whispered again in my ear, how a child snaps out from a tree and the cord world circles and circles around the black mouth of its own equator, sealing itself back together again.
Welcome, Gilberto and Patricia, to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
What was the name of that composition and who wrote it?
That composition is a very famous Brazilian composition. The name is Brasileirinho, which means Little Brazilian. Was composed by a guy named Jacob Bandolim.
How long ago?
That song's from the 50s. It's it's kind of old song, but it's so popular in Brazil. Everybody knows that song. It's originally an instrumental song, but right now you can find some people who wrote.
If I were looking through a bin in a CD store, would it be in pop? Would it be in jazz? What bin would you find it in?
Okay, it's a very tricky question because
okay. I like to ask trick questions.
Yeah,
that's good.
The chorinho, that style that we play right now, is kind of instrumental style from Brazil. So people in Rio de Janeiro, they play that thing with just guitar, flute, pandeiro, cavaquinho, other string instruments. So it's kind of Brazilian jazz.
Okay.
Okay. So it's not a pop,
right?
But that's it.
We would think of it, if it was an American tune, it would be a jazz standard. It would be in everybody's book, basically.
Yeah, you'll be.
Now, tell me a little about the pandeiro. That's more than a tambourine.
Okay,
right?
that's a pandeiro. It's a Brazilian version of the tambourine. We don't play like the regular ones like that.
Right.
So we play
in American music, the tambourine is oftentimes just somebody banging out in fours because they need to do something with their hand. You know, it's like the lead singer holds it. Obviously, in Brazilian music, it's an art form.
Yeah, in Brazilian music, the whole of the tambourine is one of the most important percussion instruments because you can have all the sounds of the batucada in it. The batucada. The batucada is this. Means a lot of drums playing together.
Thank you. Thank you for translating.
Yeah.
I grew up in New Jersey, you know.
Okay.
Okay.
So you can have the low tones like.
Yeah.
And you can have that kinds, and you can have the jingle sound, and the tambourine has the main beat of the samba, which is like. That thing defines that this is samba. And when you listen to that, so you can find, oh, this is samba.
How long have you been playing pandeiro?
Okay, when I was young in Brazil, everybody was using to listen rock and roll, and I was into it. So I discovered the pandeiro, and so you can play everything like a drum set. Like so I loved that. So
you were 15 at the time, 12?
Yeah, I was 15.
Yeah.
And also it's so light, it's not like a drum set that's so heavy.
you can get to the gig 10 minutes before it starts and you're ready to go.
Yeah, just some little mic and everything.
What are you going to take us out with? I want you to play another tune, but what's it called?
We will play another tune it's a kind of baião. Baião is the music from my region of Brazil.
Okay.
And that song is from Quarteto Novo. It was an old group too. Was wrote by Hermeto Pascoal, and it's called O Ovo.
Okay, take us home.
Thank you.